February 2nd, 1980. For most of America, it was just another Saturday. But for the 1,156 men crammed inside the penitentiary of New Mexico, it was the start of 36 hours of pure hell on earth. 33 of those inmates wouldn't live to see Monday morning. And their deaths? They weren't quick, and they certainly weren't merciful. They were the brutal outcome of a tinderbox packed with desperation, shocking neglect, and a rage that had been simmering for years. When it finally blew, it ignited an inferno, a chapter so dark, it remains one of the bloodiest in American prison history. Now, this isn't just a story about a prison riot. It's a terrifying glimpse into a system pushed to its absolute breaking point. A system where the murder rates inside prison walls can actually rival those in active war zones. Think about this. America locks up more people than any other country on the planet. We're talking over 1.9 million souls behind bars. That weekend, the penitentiary of New Mexico was like a pressure cooker, a miniature version of all the forces building up in that massive system. And when that pressure cooker exploded, it unleashed a wave of violence so savage, it left a deep scar on the nation's conscience. This is the story of those 36 hours. The United States has a few prisons whose names alone send a shiver down your spine. Alcatraz, San Quentin, Angola. Places that echo with stories of harshness and hopelessness. Well, long before 1980, the Penitentiary of New Mexico, or PNM as it was often called, had already earned its own grim reputation. It was built back in 1956 to replace an even older, more decrepit facility. But by February 1980, this new prison was anything but a model of good corrections. So, what led to the explosion? It wasn't just one thing. It was a toxic mix of failures, one piled on top of another. Overcrowding was out of control. PNM was designed for fewer than 963 inmates, but it was groaning under the weight of nearly 1,157 men. Some say it was running at 150% capacity. Imagine men stuffed into crumbling dormitories, sometimes 2 or 3 crammed into cells built for a single person. Personal space? Forget it. Tension was thick in the air, something you could almost touch. And to make things worse, non-violent, first-time offenders were often thrown in with hardened, violent criminals. A truly dangerous cocktail in such tight quarters. The quality of life, if you can even call it that, was dismal. The food was bad, sanitation was a nightmare, and any programs for education, recreation, or actual rehabilitation were either non-existent or had been slashed. All this did was breed boredom and explosive frustration. Then, in 1975, new prison leadership came in. Their idea? Tighter restrictions. But this also led to a critical shortage of properly trained guards. Guard turnover was sky high, sometimes hitting 80%. Many of the guards walking the tiers were young, green, and totally unequipped to handle an increasingly volatile inmate population. And then there was the snitch game, a dangerous practice that threw gasoline on an already smoldering fire. Trying to keep control with too few resources, prison officials apparently leaned on inmates, coercing them into becoming informants. This bred a deep, corrosive mistrust and paranoia throughout the prison. Inmates were turned against each other, shattering any chance of unity. If you were suspected of being a snitch, you were a marked man, living every day under the threat of savage revenge. Medical and mental health care? Woefully inadequate. We hear stories from prisons all over America, especially those with violent pasts, about the system failing to provide even basic care, sometimes leading to deaths that could have been prevented. At PNM, inmates with serious mental health problems were often just warehoused, their conditions getting worse and worse in that brutal environment. Lawsuits, like Duran versus Apodaca filed in 1977, had already flagged the cruel and unusual punishment and unconstitutional conditions at PNM. This lawsuit actually raised inmates' hopes for quick changes, but real improvements were painfully slow to arrive, just cranking up the resentment even more. The air inside PNM was thick with injustice and a crushing sense of hopelessness. Officials had been warned about the deteriorating conditions and the inmates' rising fury, but those warnings were mostly ignored. The prison was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning dangerously short. The horrors that were about to erupt at the penitentiary of New Mexico didn't just come out of nowhere. America's prison landscape was already, and in many ways still is, scarred by institutions infamous for their brutal conditions and violent histories. Take Alcatraz, the Rock, sitting cold in San Francisco Bay. It was built to be the ultimate in maximum security, minimum privilege. It held some of America's most notorious criminals, men like Al Capone and Alvin Carpes. Its sheer isolation and iron-fisted regime were designed to break even the toughest spirits. While Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers famously challenged its escape-proof reputation in 1962, Alcatraz's legacy is mostly one of grim, relentless confinement. Then there's San Quentin, California's oldest prison, dating back to 1852. It has an equally dark past. It's home to the state's only death row for men and has seen countless infamous figures within its walls, including Charles Manson and Richard Ramirez. For decades, it's been defined by chronic overcrowding, crumbling buildings, and constant violence. And Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, earned itself the chilling name the bloodiest prison in the South. Built on a former plantation, its history is steeped in forced labor, extreme brutality, and terrifyingly high death rates. There were times when inmates, in pure desperation against the inhumanity, would slash their own Achilles tendons. And, of course, there was Attica. The 1971 uprising at New York's Attica Correctional Facility was a brutal warning of what was to come in New Mexico. 43 people died when state troopers stormed the prison to crush the rebellion. It was a bloody reminder of what happens when overcrowding, abuse, and the denial of basic human rights and mental health care are left to fester. The Massacre Commission, which investigated Attica, called the assault the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, if you don't count the 19th century Indian massacres. Attica ripped the lid off the simmering tensions and deep-rooted problems that infected so many American prisons. These places, each with its own terrible history of suffering, painted a bigger picture. A correctional system struggling with its own internal conflicts, security versus humane treatment, punishment versus rehabilitation. The penitentiary of New Mexico was just another, especially volatile, spot on this very troubled map. The spark finally hit the powder in the pre-dawn quiet of Saturday, February 2nd, 1980. Around 1:40 a.m., in Dormitory E2, a medium security unit that was also, problematically, housing some higher security inmates because of construction elsewhere, a group of inmates overpowered 4 correctional officers during a routine lockdown. They grabbed their keys and radios and quickly started unlocking other dormitories and cell blocks. Within minutes, they'd captured more officers. In total, 12 guards would become hostages, their lives hanging by a thread for the next day and a half. With guards taken out and keys in their possession, the inmates surged towards the prison's administrative wing and, crucially, the control center. Ongoing construction meant some security grills and doors were either missing or easily bypassed. Even worse, tools like blowtorches had been carelessly left behind by renovation crews. In the hands of the rioters, these became terrifying weapons, used to cut through locks and bars, giving them access to areas that were supposed to be secure. They smashed their way into the control center, and just like that, they had effective command of the entire prison. What happened next wasn't a coordinated rebellion with clear demands, like at Attica. Instead, the New Mexico riot rapidly spiraled into a chaotic, horrifying eruption of pent-up fury, score settling, and brutality so extreme it's hard to fathom. And most of it was directed by inmates against other inmates. That snitch game had planted seeds of murderous hatred, and now it was harvest time. Cell Block 4, the protective custody unit, became a terrifying focal point of the violence. This was where they housed inmates who had informed on others, or who were considered at risk from the general population. To the rioters, these men were the worst kind of traitors. Using the captured keys and those blowtorches, groups of inmates, some forming what witnesses would later call death squads, hunted down their terrified victims. The stories that came out of those 36 hours are sickening. Men were dragged from their cells, tortured, mutilated, and murdered in the most nightmarish ways. Some were reportedly burned alive with blowtorches. Others were beaten to death, stabbed, or dismembered. The prison pharmacy was broken into, and a deadly flood of drugs washed through the prison, leading to overdoses that just added to the body count. Administrative offices were ransacked, records went up in flames, and the prison itself was systematically wrecked. The gymnasium was burned to the ground. The 12 captive officers went through their own hell. They were beaten, taunted, and several were brutally sexually assaulted. That none of them were ultimately killed was perhaps one of the only slivers of mercy in that absolute maelstrom of death. Negotiations between state officials and the inmates were patchy and often made no sense because there was no clear leadership among the rioters. Some inmates did try to protect certain guards or act as mediators, but the overwhelming feeling was one of total anarchy and revenge. The air was filled with screams, explosions, and the roar of fires, a soundtrack to a complete descent into savagery. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, February 3rd, after 36 gut-wrenching hours, the riot started to burn itself out. Many of the most violent rioters were exhausted or knocked out by drugs. Heavily armed state police, backed by Santa Fe police officers, finally moved in to retake the charred, blood-soaked facility. They met very little organized resistance. The scene that awaited them was one of absolute devastation. The prison was a smoldering ruin, its corridors slick with blood and littered with wreckage. And then, there were the bodies. Official sources would eventually confirm that 33 inmates were dead. Over 200 others were treated for injuries, everything from stabbings and beatings to severe drug overdoses and smoke inhalation. The 12 guards, though alive, had suffered serious physical and psychological wounds. The penitentiary of New Mexico Riot was over, but its bloody legacy was just beginning. It was, and still is, the most violent prison riot in the history of the United States. Right after the riot, the penitentiary of New Mexico was nothing short of a disaster zone. The physical damage was enormous, with repairs estimated at over $10 million, and that was 1980s money. But the human cost was far more devastating. 33 lives snuffed out in the most brutal ways imaginable, hundreds injured, and who knows how many others scarred for life by the trauma they'd seen or endured. Investigations kicked off immediately. New Mexico's Attorney General at the time, Jeff Bingaman, led a major inquiry into what caused the riot and exactly what happened. The report that followed, the report of the Attorney General on the February the 2nd and 3rd, 1980, riot at the Penitentiary of New Mexico, laid bare the horrifying details and the systemic failures. It pointed straight at the overcrowding, the terrible conditions, the lack of enough trained staff, the cuts to inmate programs, and that infamous snitch game as key reasons it all went so wrong. The riot exposed catastrophic failures in how the prison was managed and overseen. It sent shockwaves through the entire national corrections system, forcing a grim rethink of conditions in maximum security prisons across America. Back in New Mexico, that lawsuit, Duran versus Apodaca, which had been filed in 1977 over the prison conditions, suddenly had a lot more urgency. A consent decree was signed just 5 months after the riot, laying out a list of improvements that had to be made. But actually getting those changes made was slow going at first. It wasn't really until a special master was appointed and a new state administration put in a more serious effort in the mid-1980s that real reforms started to happen. These changes included more staff, better training for correctional officers, building new facilities to ease overcrowding, and more funding. The New Mexico Corrections Training Academy, the first of its kind in the nation, was set up in 1980, a direct response to the desperate need for better prepared staff. Still, the scars from the 1980 riot run incredibly deep and have been tough to heal. For the survivors, both inmates and guards, the psychological trauma haunted them for decades. Some even argue the violence didn't really stop on February 3rd. They say it just continued in slow motion over the next months and years, with more deaths and assaults tied to the leftover tension and the thirst for revenge. Hundreds of civil lawsuits were filed against the state by inmates and their families. Old Main, the main part of the prison where the riot happened, was finally closed down in 1998. Now it just stands there, a grim monument. Sometimes it's used for tours or as a movie set, a silent, hulking reminder of those 36 hours of carnage. Decades later, the New Mexico prison system, like a lot of others across the US, is still dealing with big challenges. Lawsuits about things like long-term solitary confinement and not enough medical care keep popping up. For instance, a 2025 lawsuit highlighted issues with inmates being kept in tiny, filthy cells in solitary for way too long, leading to severe psychological problems. Another recent lawsuit talked about disgusting kitchen conditions and pest infestations making incarcerated women sick at a different New Mexico facility. The 1980 riot was a brutal wake-up call. But you have to ask, have all its lessons truly been learned? Those 36 hours of bloodshed at the penitentiary of New Mexico in February 1980 weren't just a prison riot. They were a terrifying symptom of a system stretched way beyond its limits. The deadly mix of extreme overcrowding, brutal and filthy conditions, not enough staff, the destructive snitch system, and a complete lack of hope, all of it created an environment where unimaginable violence didn't just happen, it exploded. 33 men died at the hands of other inmates, many in ways that are too horrific to describe. It's a stark testament to the sheer desperation and rage that had been festering inside those walls. While stories like the legendary escapes from Alcatraz might capture our imagination with a different kind of prison drama, the New Mexico riot gives us a much grimmer, and you could argue, a much more important look at what incarceration is really like when basic human dignity is stripped away. It shined a harsh light on the horrific fallout from systemic neglect and abuse in prisons, issues that were also tragically clear in the Attica uprising and, sadly, still plague prisons today. The riot did lead to investigations and, eventually, some reforms in New Mexico. It also dragged the terrible state of many American prisons into the national spotlight. But the sheer, unadulterated brutality of those 36 hours, that serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of what can happen when a society just warehouses its citizens in conditions that breed violence and despair. The legacy of the New Mexico Penitentiary riot is a demand for constant watchfulness, for real reform, and for a promise to make sure that such an explosion of inhumanity never, ever happens again. The ghosts of those 33 men, and the shattered lives of everyone who lived through that weekend, demand nothing less. The events at the penitentiary of New Mexico are a dark, unforgettable chapter in American history. What do you think about the state of America's prisons today? And what about the lessons learned, or maybe unlearned, from tragedies like this one? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, don't forget to watch our next video. We'll be exploring the world's most secure prisons and the incredible stories hidden within their walls. Subscribe so you don't miss it.